The fluorescent lights hummed their permanent song above the pediatric ICU at Cedar Creek Medical, a sound Margaret Walsh had learned to filter out years ago, the way soldiers learn to sleep through distant mortars. She moved through the ward at 4:08 a.m. with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory, not caffeine, her scrubs a pale blue that had seen 12-hour shifts so often they'd faded almost white at the seams. The night shift at Cedar Creek was quiet in that particular way that hospitals were quiet, full of small mechanical sounds that never quite stopped, ventilators breathing, monitors counting heartbeats, the soft squeak of her rubber-soled shoes on linoleum that had been waxed so many times it gleamed like dark water. Room for 18 held Emma Callahan, 8 years old, trembling beneath a blanket that did nothing to stop the shaking. The girl's small frame looked impossibly fragile against the hospital mattress, her dark hair matted from fever and fear. She'd been admitted 4 days ago after her third grand mal seizure in 2 weeks, the kind of medical mystery that made even the experienced nurses exchange glances in the break room. Margaret had read the chart twice, the way she read everything, noting the medications that Dr. Mercer had prescribed with increasing aggression, each dose escalating as if volume alone could solve what remained undiagnosed. "Good morning, Emma," Margaret said, her voice soft but not weak, the voice of someone who'd learned that gentleness and strength weren't opposites. She pulled a rolling stool beside the bed and checked the fall line that had been running since midnight, her movements precise as surgery. The pediatric catheter was 24 gauge, positioned perfectly in the small vein at Emma's wrist, and Margaret had placed it on the first try last night, a skill that came from having done it approximately 847 times across 7 years and 3 months. "How are we feeling this morning?" Emma's eyes were still half closed, her pupils slightly dilated from the anticonvulsants coursing through her small bloodstream. "My head hurts," she whispered. "And I don't like the purple stuff." The purple stuff was phenobarbital, a drug that had been used since 1912, long before anyone understood why seizures happened or how to actually stop them. Margaret made a note in the chart, not about the complaint, which wouldn't matter to Mercer, but about the timing, the exact hour, the observation that would become the kind of documentation that either protected you or buried you in a hospital, depending on who read it. She moved through the vitals with practiced efficiency, blood pressure 104/68, heart rate 89, oxygen saturation 98% on room air, temperature 37.2 Celsius. Everything stable. Everything normal for a child whose brain was apparently betraying her without medical explanation. Margaret recorded each number in handwriting so precise it looked printed, each digit in the perfect place, because details mattered. Details were the difference between being believed and being dismissed. Between rooms, Margaret walked past the observation window of the nursing station where Dr. Marcus Mercer stood reviewing charts, his Italian leather shoes catching the fluorescent light. He was 43 years old with the kind of expensive haircut that required maintenance, and he wore a watch that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, a Rolex Submariner, the kind of timepiece that announced itself without saying anything at all. He glanced up as she passed, his eyes tracking her movement with the precision of someone cataloging information, and Margaret felt the weight of his attention the way you feel a surveillance camera. She didn't change her pace. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply continued moving, her limp barely perceptible, favoring her left leg in the way that came from a 2009 IED in the Jolan district of Fallujah that had taken her sergeant's right leg entirely and left her with a titanium rod and recurring pain that no VA doctor could fully explain. Mercer had been watching her work for 6 weeks now, ever since she'd transferred to Cedar Creek from Houston Methodist, and Margaret had noticed something in his observation that went beyond normal physician-nurse dynamics. There was anxiety underneath it. The kind of anxiety that came from seeing someone who paid too much attention to detail, who documented with meticulous precision, who didn't miss the inconsistencies in prescribing patterns that might suggest something was wrong. Margaret's charts had already caught 2 medication errors, one a missed dose that another nurse should have documented, one a doubled administration that could have been dangerous. She'd reported both through proper channels. She'd done it quietly. And Mercer had noticed her noticing. In room for 16, a 6-year-old named Tommy needed his morning medications adjusted, and Margaret moved through the process with the kind of calm that came from having done it in places where mistakes meant blood on your hands instead of paperwork. She calculated the dose per kilogram of body weight, 18 kilograms, dosing at 0.5 milligrams per kilogram, meaning 9 milligrams total of loratadine for allergies. The math was automatic. The precision was non-negotiable. She prepared the medication from a sterile cup, drew it into a 10 milliliter syringe, and introduced it through the boy's PEG tube with water flushes before and after, every step documented, every action witnessed by the 4 monitor mounted on the wall like a silent observer. Tommy's mother arrived at 5:15 a.m. with coffee and worry etched into the lines around her eyes. "Is he getting better?" she asked, and Margaret understood that the question wasn't really about medical improvement. It was about hope. It was about whether this child would go home the same person who'd arrived, or whether something fundamental would be broken and never quite healed. "He's stable," Margaret said, and that word, stable, carried a weight that civilians rarely understood. Stable meant the machines were working. Stable meant the medication was holding. Stable meant another day. The doctor will be making rounds at 7. We'll know more then. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that Tommy would probably be fine, that his condition appeared self-limiting, that the additional medications Mercer had prescribed seemed excessive for a straightforward viral infection. She didn't say that because saying such things out loud was dangerous, because doctors didn't like nurses who thought, because a woman who questioned authority could be made very small very quickly in a hospital hierarchy that was built on exactly that kind of unquestioning obedience. The break room at 6:02 a.m. was empty except for the smell of coffee that had been brewing since the day's shift ended, a bitter taste that Margaret had learned to accept years ago. She sat in one of the plastic chairs that had been worn smooth by thousands of shifts, and she reached inside her jacket, the same jacket she'd worn over her scrubs every night for 4 months, and felt the outline of the faded unit patch sewn carefully into the lining. It was Navy issue, the kind of embroidered patch that came from the Marine Expeditionary Unit that had been based out of Camp Lejeune in 2009, with a designation that meant something to exactly 1,247 people still living. The edges were frayed from being touched, from being a private reassurance during long nights when the weight of secrets became almost physical. She held it for exactly 7 seconds, then released it and let her hand rest on the table in front of her. Her knuckles showed thin white scars from sutures that had been placed by a medical corps officer in an aid station, scars that wouldn't show under the standard hospital lighting unless you knew to look for them. She'd learned to accept that she would carry the evidence of 2 lives in her body, the one she lived now, quiet and competent and invisible, and the one she'd left behind in a desert where the sand got into everything and the blood never quite came clean. The sound of footsteps made her straighten, and she pulled her hand back to the table just as Dr. Mercer entered the break room. He didn't greet her. He simply moved to the coffee machine and poured himself a cup with the casual confidence of someone who'd never considered that other people might also want coffee, might also have been awake since before dawn, might also be running on empty. He held the cup without the pinched finger grip of someone worried about heat. His hands were steady, pale, uncalloused, hands that had never held pressure dressings against exit wounds or calculated blood loss by the color of bandages. "The Callahan girl," he said without turning around. "She's going to need an EEG and another round of workup. I want you to prepare the equipment this morning." "Of course, Dr. Mercer," Margaret said, and her voice was the voice of someone trained to be accommodating, to be pleasant, to be the kind of nurse that doctors wanted in their hospitals. It was a carefully constructed voice, different from the one that lived deeper inside, the one that had ordered for Marines onto a Black Hawk under fire and had them actually obey her without question. "I'll have everything ready by 7. He left without responding, and Margaret sat alone again with her coffee and the knowledge that something had shifted, that his attention had become sharper, more focused, that he was watching her the way a predator watches prey it hasn't quite decided whether to kill. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound of the elevator arriving on the 5th floor, the muffled sound of the doors opening and closing, and then the sound of footsteps, military footsteps, the kind of measured pace that came from someone trained to move with purpose, someone used to command, walking toward the pediatric ward where his daughter was trembling in room for 18, waiting for answers that Margaret suspected no one in this hospital was actually equipped to provide. The elevator doors opened on the 5th floor of Cedar Creek Medical, and General James Callahan's footsteps carried the weight of command down the pediatric corridor. Margaret heard him before she saw him, boots on tile, measured pace, the kind of walk that belonged to someone accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered. Emma was sleeping when he arrived at room 308, her small frame barely raising the blanket, monitors beeping their steady rhythm around her like electronic sentries. Margaret was checking the fall line when Dr. Mercer materialized in the doorway behind the general, his presence filling the space like oil spreading across water. "General Callahan," Mercer said, his voice smooth as polished glass. "I wanted to brief you personally on your daughter's care before my morning rounds conclude." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He never did. He stepped into the room with Emma's chart held open like a prosecutor presenting evidence, and Margaret felt the temperature in the space shift. She continued her work without pause, her fingers steady on the foretubing, her face a blank slate carved from years of combat zones where showing reaction meant showing weakness. "This nurse," Mercer announced, loud enough for the hallway to hear, loud enough for two nurses passing outside to pause in their steps, failed to follow proper documentation protocol. Again. He waved the chart toward Margaret without looking at her, the dismissal so casual it landed like a blade. "I call her nurse night shift, since she apparently works in the dark. Doesn't understand the basic framework of hospital procedure." Emma shifted in her sleep, her breathing shallow and quick. Margaret's jaw tightened, a single muscle jumping once beneath her skin, but her hands remained rock-steady as she adjusted the flow rate. The general stared at her face for 3 full seconds, his eyes traveling across her features like he was trying to place something, then moving to her hands. Those hands. Scarred. Competent. Moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in environments far worse than a pediatric ward in San Antonio. "Your daughter deserves better than incompetent care," Mercer continued, his eyes never leaving the general's face. He was performing now, Margaret realized. This wasn't about her documentation. This was theater. "I sincerely apologize that she's been subjected to substandard nursing while she's been under our roof." The general said nothing. His jaw tightened in an echo of Margaret's own restraint, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of it. Then it was gone. "Perhaps if you spent less time questioning physician orders and more time learning basic nursing competence, Nurse Walsh, we wouldn't have these problems." Mercer's voice had taken on an edge now, the arrogance of a man who understood that he held the institutional power in this room. He was a physician. She was a nurse. The hierarchy was absolute. The general was listening. The game was being played out perfectly. Margaret's fingers found the edge of her scrub pocket. She pressed her knuckles against the fabric until they went white, then forced them to relax. She did not speak. She did not defend herself. She did not allow her face to betray the storm moving behind her eyes, the same storm that had carried her through 3 tours in Ramadi, that had kept her steady while watching men die, that had taught her that survival often meant being invisible. "I'll monitor her closely through the night, General," Mercer said, finally turning to leave. "We have the best equipment, the best medications. She'll be fine." The confidence in his voice was absolute. He believed his own story completely. That was what made him dangerous, not the malice, but the certainty. An hour later, Margaret sat in the break room with her lunch. She'd made a sandwich before her shift, turkey and mustard on wheat bread, a small bag of pretzels, a bottle of water she'd filled from the fountain. The break room smelled like old coffee and the chemical tang of the microwave. She sat at the corner table, the one nearest the window where she could see the parking lot and the lights of San Antonio beyond, and she opened her lunch. 3 nurses came in. Sarah from day shift, Jennifer who worked pediatrics with her, and Tom from the ICU. They grabbed their food from the refrigerator, and the moment Margaret's sandwich hit the table, the room shifted. Sarah's eyes flicked toward her, then away. Jennifer mumbled something about getting back to rounds. Tom didn't even acknowledge her presence. They left together, their conversation resuming the second they hit the hallway, their laughter drifting back through the closing door like an insult wrapped in politeness. Margaret ate her sandwich alone. The turkey was dry. The pretzels were stale. She drank the water and didn't taste it. The vending machine hummed its electric song, a sound like hornets trapped in a wall. Outside, San Antonio sprawled under January darkness, indifferent to her isolation, indifferent to the way her career was being dismantled by a man who understood that in hospitals, narrative mattered more than truth. By shift change, Mercer had posted the warning. The unit board hung on the wall outside the main nursing station, the place where everyone passed, where schedules were posted and mandatory training was announced, and where Dr. Mercer had carefully tacked a single sheet of white paper with Margaret's name on it. She saw it as she passed, returning from checking on a patient in room 310. Her eyes caught the words without stopping, without breaking her stride, but the letters sank into her consciousness like stones into dark water. M. Walsh, insubordination and dangerous disregard for hospital policy, final warning before termination review. Mercer had signed it in blue ink. His handwriting was precise and arrogant, each letter a small assertion of power. Margaret stood in front of the board for exactly 8 seconds. She would have made it 3, but she forced herself to read it twice, to absorb the full weight of the accusation, to ensure there was no room for surprise when the next domino fell. Her face remained blank. A passing resident, Dr. Chen, slowed his pace as he approached, saw her standing there, and changed his trajectory to avoid walking past her. She noticed. She noted it. She filed it away with the same methodical precision she'd used to catalogue trauma injuries in field hospitals. The supply closet was on the east wing, a small room lined with boxes of gauze pads, for tubing, syringes, medications waiting to be stocked. Margaret slipped inside during her break, closing the door behind her. The fluorescent light overhead hummed and flickered, a sound like electricity slowly burning through paper. She stood surrounded by supplies that meant nothing, in a room where no one would think to look for her, and she reached inside her jacket. The patch was small, faded to a color that was no longer quite white and no longer quite gray. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. A unit emblem stitched with hands that were not her own, sewn into the jacket lining by someone in a forward operating base in Ramadi 7 years ago. Margaret had carried this jacket through 3 rotations, through 2 promotions, through the classified debriefing that had ended her active service and begun her new life as a registered nurse in a hospital on the Texas coast. She didn't cry. Her combat training had erased that response from her nervous system, burned it out like a scar tissue over an old wound. She simply held the patch between her thumb and forefinger, felt the weight of what it represented, the lives she'd saved before this hospital, the authority she'd carried in a combat zone, the captain's rank that was folded away in a safety deposit box 2 miles from Cedar Creek Medical, waiting for a day when she might need to prove who she actually was. Her face remained blank. Her breathing remained steady. She was experiencing humiliation and professional isolation, and her body was responding with the calm that came from having already survived much worse. In Ramadi, men had died in her hands. She had held their blood and their weight and their final breaths, and she had kept working. This was nothing. This was a bureaucratic knife, dull and slow. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the worst part at all. The worst part was that Emma's monitor was about to go into status epilepticus at 0200 hours, when the ward was at skeleton crew and the only person standing between an 8-year-old child and death would be Margaret herself, standing directly across from the man whose incompetence had put the girl there in the first place. Margaret left the supply closet and returned to the floor. Emma was sleeping peacefully in room 308, her father gone home to rest, her monitors beeping their steady rhythm in the dark. Margaret checked her vitals without waking her, blood pressure normal, oxygen saturation 98% on room air, heart rate 72 and regular. Everything looked stable. Everything looked fine. But Margaret had learned in Ramadi to trust her instincts more than her instruments, and her instincts were screaming. The monitors exploded at 2:04 in the morning. Emma's small body went rigid, every muscle contracting simultaneously, and the machine surrounding her crib shrieked in unison, heart rate climbing, oxygen saturation plummeting, the ventilator alarm screaming like metal on metal. Margaret was already moving before the first alert hit, her muscle memory overriding the careful passivity she'd maintained for 7 years of this cover, her hands reaching for the crash cart before anyone else in the room had registered what was happening. Status epilepticus. The worst kind. Not a seizure. A cascade of seizures without break between them, the brain firing itself into neural frenzy, the child's small frame convulsing with the force of electricity made visible, and every anticonvulsant medication Mercer had prescribed over the past 72 hours, every expensive, perfectly unnecessary drug, had done absolutely nothing. Dr. Mercer burst through the double doors with his phone already in hand, his voice sharp and commanding. Increase the lorazepam. Now. And get me 20 milligrams more of the phenytoin. His eyes found Margaret across the monitors. Step back, nurse. You're contaminating the field. Not a request. An order framed like protocol. Margaret's hands paused for exactly one breath. The rational part of her mind recognized the institutional trap. Question the doctor's direct order in front of witnesses and you became insubordinate. Follow an incorrect order and a child died. She'd faced this choice before in Ramadi, under fire, with a Marine bleeding out and a superior officer screaming contradictory commands, and she'd learned then what mattered and what didn't. She didn't step back. Instead, she moved toward Emma's bedside with the focused precision of someone who'd performed emergency procedures in the dark under mortar fire, her eyes already assessing what 7 different doctors had missed in their rushed evaluations, their eyes skimming instead of seeing. The cranial nerve palsy. The subtle neck stiffness. The fever pattern that didn't match a simple seizure disorder. The way Emma had mentioned, once, briefly, at 3 in the morning when only Margaret was listening, that her neck hurt when she touched her chin to her chest. Stop the anticonvulsants, Margaret said quietly. Not a question. Not a request. The voice that came out was the voice of a captain addressing subordinates, low and certain and carrying the weight of command she hadn't used in 7 years, the voice that had called for covering fire and ordered a field thoracotomy with a combat knife and held the attention of 14 Marines in the chaos of collapsing buildings and incoming mortars. Mercer's face went the color of old plums. Did you just? His voice rose, the pitch climbing toward hysteria. Security. I need security in this room immediately. This nurse is practicing medicine without a license. She is operating outside her scope. She is insubordinate. She is? Margaret ignored him completely. Her composure was absolute, a wall of granite, and she moved to Emma's crib with her hands already reaching for the assessment protocol she'd memorized during combat trauma training in 2016, the same protocol that had saved the life of a Taliban fighter she'd treated under enemy fire because the Hippocratic Oath didn't have a political affiliation. Lumbar puncture kit, she said crisply. Acyclovir 10 mg per kilogram for viral encephalitis protocol labs. Move. A resident froze, caught in the terrible space between the attending physician and the nurse who was giving orders that sounded like medical truth and defiance simultaneously. General Callahan stood at the foot of Emma's bed, watching his daughter seize for the 6th minute straight, and Margaret saw the moment in his face when the calculation shifted, that this was his child, that hierarchy didn't matter anymore, that authority without results was just noise. Do what she says, the general commanded. The resident moved. The nurse moved. The room reorganized around Margaret's voice the way Ramadi had reorganized around her orders when authority figured out who actually knew what they were doing. Margaret's hands were perfectly steady as she prepped the lumbar puncture site, her fingers working with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this under worse conditions than a well-lit hospital room. The needle went in. The spinal fluid came out cloudy, not clear, which meant infection, which meant viral encephalitis, not epilepsy, not status epilepticus from a poorly managed seizure disorder but actual meningitis-like inflammation of the brain tissue that every doctor in this hospital had misread as a pediatric neurological crisis. She pulled the sample and said nothing, her silence more damning than any accusation could have been. Start the acyclovir, she said. Not a recommendation. Not a suggestion. A command issued with the certainty of someone who'd held lives together with bandages and pressure and the refusal to accept that someone else's incompetence got to be her patient's death sentence. Mercer was screaming now, his voice taking on the thin, desperate quality of a man watching his institutional authority dissolve in real time, already pulling out his phone with shaking hands, already composing the emergency complaint, his fingers jabbing at his screen with the violence of impotence. She's practicing medicine. She's violated direct orders. She's operating outside her scope. Hospital administration needs to hear this. They need to know immediately that this nurse overrode a direct physician order and Margaret started the antivirals, her hand steady as surgical lasers, before running clear, then filling with a medication that would cross the blood-brain barrier and kill the viral infection that had been destroying Emma's neural tissue for 72 hours, while 7 different doctors prescribed unnecessary anti-epileptic drugs and charged the General's insurance company $47,000 for care that had made his daughter worse. For minutes after the acyclovir hit Emma's bloodstream, the seizure broke. The child's body went slack. Her muscles relaxed. The monitors stopped their frantic screaming and settled into a rhythm that approximated normal, the oxygen saturation climbing back into the low 90s, the heart rate dropping from the 180s to something survivable, and when Emma's eyes actually focused, they met Margaret's with the clarity of a child returning to consciousness. 10 minutes. Vital stabilizing. By 4 in the morning, Emma was awake and responding, squeezing her father's hand, asking for water, asking if the seizures were over, asking why her neck didn't hurt anymore. The fever was dropping. The neurological assessments were returning to normal. The child had gone from catastrophic status epilepticus to stable and improving in the time it took most hospitals to convene a real code. Margaret stepped back from the monitors and let the medical team finish their work, let the night shift nurses take over the vital sign tracking, let the system do what it was designed to do now that someone had actually diagnosed the problem correctly. She pulled off her gloves slowly, each finger coming free with the whisper of latex, and she did not look at Mercer as his phone was already pressed to his ear, his voice hoarse from screaming but still audible as he demanded that the hospital administrator be called immediately, that security remove her from the building, that documentation be filed, that her employment be terminated effective immediately for gross insubordination and practicing medicine without a license and operating outside her scope of practice and violating a direct physician order. The hospital administrator arrived at 5:17 in the morning, still in pajamas, his face the particular shade of exhausted that meant he'd been called out of bed for something significant, and Margaret heard the conversation happening in the hallway outside Emma's room, heard Mercer's voice explaining the situation, heard the administrator's voice carrying that tone of bureaucratic resignation that meant he was already calculating liability and wondering how quickly this could be resolved. By 6 in the morning, when the morning shift arrived and Emma was stable, when the viral encephalitis panel came back positive and confirmed Margaret's diagnosis in clinical black and white, when the pharmacist was already reviewing what medication should never have been prescribed to a child with inflammation of the brain tissue, by then Margaret had been formally terminated, the paperwork already signed, a formal written notice citing violation of physician orders and practicing outside her scope attached to her personnel file. Her phone buzzed at 7:02. Her Pentagon handler. The voice on the other end was ice-cold, stripped of the professional courtesy that had characterized their contact for the past 8 months. "Your cover is compromised," the voice said. "Viral encephalitis diagnosis is being documented as performed by nursing staff. Mercer will be named in the incident report. Your presence at Cedar Creek has been flagged. Extract immediately." The mission was over. 8 months of meticulous observation, 7 doctors' worth of misdiagnosis data, 23 documented cases of unnecessary pediatric medication prescriptions that aligned with Mercer's kickback arrangement with Pharma Trust Solutions, all of it rendered irrelevant because a child's life had mattered more than institutional operation security. Margaret gathered her things from her locker at 7:43, her cardboard box balanced against her hip, her locker key returned to the night supervisor, her badge deactivated, her access revoked, her employment at Cedar Creek Medical terminated for cause. She wore the small smile of someone who'd just completed a field extraction under hostile conditions, her shoulders set at an angle that suggested this was not a defeat but a strategic withdrawal, her eyes already moving past the hospital toward whatever came next. The morning rain hammered against the parking lot asphalt as she stood at the bus stop, the cardboard box soggy in her grip, containing the things that had made up her civilian cover, a coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent that had never quite adjusted to fluorescent lighting, a photograph of her unit in Ramadi with all their faces blurred except for one signature in the corner of the frame, the name Nightingale written in someone else's handwriting under the shadows. "Where faces used to be," She reached into her jacket and touched the faded marine unit patch sewn into the lining, felt the familiar fabric against her fingertips, and let out a breath that had been held for 8 months. The mission had failed. The cover had blown. The institutional systems had proven corrupt exactly as suspected, and a child had lived because a nurse had refused to let her rank matter more than her oath. The bus pulled up through the rain, its doors opening with a pneumatic hiss, and Margaret Walsh climbed aboard carrying her cardboard box and her complicated victory and the knowledge that somewhere in the pediatric ward, a general was holding his daughter's hand while her fever broke, while her neurological function normalized, while she asked innocently when she could go home. The bus pulled away from Cedar Creek Medical at 6:47 in the morning, and Margaret Walsh didn't watch the hospital disappear in the rear window. She watched the road instead, her cardboard box balanced against her thigh, water already seeping through the bottom corner where the rain had found its weakness. The box smelled like wet paper and dying plant, the succulent she'd kept on her locker shelf for 3 years without once remembering to water it, its leaves the color of old rust. Inside the box, a cracked ceramic mug with faded letters spelling World's Okayest Nurse. A frame holding 8 by 10 inches of Ramadi, 2017. For Marines in desert camo, grinning like they'd never heard of mortality, like the next 48 hours wouldn't rewrite their lives in ways neither combat nor distance could fully erase. A young lieutenant on the left, fresh tattoo on his forearm still red and angry, the letters reading M. Walsh in Marine Corps blocky script. Margaret didn't open the box. She knew what was inside. The bus lurched to a stop 2 blocks from her apartment. She stood, gripping the overhead rail, hand steady as stainless steel surgical clamps, and walked down the aisle while water dripped from the bottom of the box onto the bus floor. Nobody noticed. Nobody looked at her. This was always how it worked. The invisible ones carried the world, and the world never once glanced up to acknowledge the weight. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom in North Olmos Park, 1,200 square feet of beige and silence. She'd rented it furnished 2 years ago under a Department of Defense cover identity that was now being dissolved like sugar in acid. Margaret set the cardboard box on her kitchen table and stood for exactly 30 seconds, allowing her hands to tremble visibly for the first time in 4 days. Then she exhaled, pressed her palms flat against the table, and straightened her spine. She unpacked methodically. The succulent went to the windowsill where it would probably die within a month, but at least it would die in sunlight. The mug went into the cabinet between a coffee cup from a Starbucks in Kandahar and a glass from a hotel in Prague. The photograph she held longer, staring at the faces, Gator with his gap-toothed smile, Iron Man with his mountain-range shoulders, Clayton with his arm around her shoulders even though sergeants weren't supposed to do that in official photos. And Callahan. Callahan with the tattoo still healing, with the light in his eyes that said he still believed his life would follow a predictable trajectory. It wouldn't. Her thoracotomy with a combat knife and improvised sutures would change that. His daughter Emma would trigger reconnaissance that he didn't know he'd authorized. His Pentagon connections would ultimately undo the one operation that might have worked undetected if Margaret had just kept her mouth closed and let the child stay sick. She placed the photograph on her dresser, face out, and then her phone rang. The number had no name attached. Just a secure line that connected to a Pentagon office where people wore suits instead of uniforms and made decisions that affected military personnel they'd never met. Margaret answered on the second ring. Captain Walsh. The voice was male, mid-50s, with the flattened effect of someone who'd heard too many bad reports. This is your handler. The operation is compromised. Completely. Understood, sir. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, the nurse version, the deferential version, the Margaret who needed this job to keep her cover intact. The girl's father ran a background check. Routine. His security liaison flagged your clearance. The hospital administration is about to receive notification that Cedar Creek Medical was under federal investigation. When they do, the entire operation collapses. 7 different doctors in that system, Captain. 7. We had documentation trails on 5 of them. Dr. Mercer's kickback scheme alone was worth $2.4 million in unnecessary prescriptions. $2.4 million. You saved one child, the handler continued, and his voice carried the weight of an operation unraveling in real time. You may have compromised 7 medical professionals' prosecutions. The case law is murky. Once the hospital knows they were under surveillance, every defendant's attorney will file motions claiming entrapment, claiming investigative overreach. The child was seizing. I understand, Captain. I do. You operated under your oath as a medical professional. That was correct. That was also catastrophic to the operation. You're being pulled effective immediately. Your cover identity is being dissolved. You are to return to active duty within 72 hours at Camp Leshan. Do you have any questions? Margaret looked at the photograph. At Callahan's untattooed forearm, at the version of him that still existed somewhere inside the general who'd stood in the pediatric wing not knowing he was in the presence of his own ghost. No questions, sir. For what it's worth, Captain, you did the right thing. Just not the mission. The line went dead. She held the phone for another 3 seconds, then set it on the dresser beside the photograph. Outside, San Antonio was waking up, traffic building on the street below, someone's radio playing a country song about loss, the general hum of a city that had no idea a federal investigation had just imploded at one of its teaching hospitals. Margaret opened her closet and pulled out the dress uniform she'd packed 2 years ago, still in its plastic sheath from the dry cleaner. The blues looked wrong in this apartment. They looked like they belonged to someone with a real name and a real life, not an interpolated ghost wearing a borrowed identity. She pressed her palms against her eyes and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching a child recover while your career collapsed in real time. 2 minutes. That was all military discipline would allow. At 6:58, Margaret left her apartment and walked to the nearest bus stop. The one where she'd stood 3 days earlier with a cardboard box that weighed less than a sandbag but felt heavier than body armor. January rain had come in the night, hard and cold, the kind that falls from clouds sitting directly overhead like they'd been waiting specifically for this moment. She set the box on the bench and watched water purl across the plastic bag protecting the Ramadi photograph. Her breath fogged in the January cold. 32 degrees. Clear. Her internal compass still calculating distances and temperatures like her body hadn't received notification that the mission was over. She could see the hospital from here if she craned her neck, Cedar Creek's emergency room entrance, the helicopter pad on the roof where no helicopter had landed because there was no emergency dramatic enough to require one. Just a child. Just a diagnosis the 7 doctors had missed. Just a nurse who decided that her oath meant something different than her orders. The bus arrived at 7:03. She picked up the box and climbed aboard, and somewhere in the pediatric ward at Cedar Creek Medical, Emma Callahan woke fully for the first time in 4 days. Her fever had broken around 3 in the morning. The antivirals were working. Her brain inflammation was receding like a retreating tide, leaving the girl it had taken intact and breathing and asking in a small voice if the nice night nurse would come visit her. General Callahan didn't answer. He was holding his daughter's hand, staring at the fall line, trying to remember the face of the nurse who'd shouted orders like she'd been trained in chaos. Trying to remember if he'd ever thanked her. Trying to remember if she was still working the morning shift. He didn't know she was gone. He didn't know the cardboard box was being carried toward a 1-bedroom apartment in North Olmos Park. He didn't know that the woman who'd saved Emma's life had been trained to extract wounded Marines from ambush sites in Ramadi, that his name was permanently inked on her forearm beneath her sleeve, that she'd carried him for 6 miles through mortar fire with a field thoracotomy barely holding his chest cavity together. He would find out in 3 days. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Margaret Walsh had made a choice that saved one child and lost the chance to save the others, the ones who would arrive at Cedar Creek Medical next month, and the month after that, prescribed medications they didn't need by doctors she would no longer be there to document, to watch, to stop. The worst part was that the mission had been right. The whole reason she'd spent 2 years as a nurse was because the fraud was real. The kickback scheme was real. The unnecessary suffering was real. And she'd just burned it all down because a child had looked at her with trust and a father had unknowingly sealed her fate with a routine security check. Margaret stood at the bus stop and let the rain soak through her jacket, let the water find the seams of her cardboard box, let the Ramadi photograph deteriorate in its plastic shelter one water molecule at a time. She didn't move. She didn't call anyone. She just stood there in the January cold with her breath fogging and her hand steady and her expression blank, the way she'd been trained, the way soldiers stand when the operation is over and the orders are clear and there's nothing left to do but wait for the next deployment. The photograph would blur eventually. The ink would run. The faces would become watercolors instead of memories. But the name on that forearm would never wash away. Some things got permanent. Some things survived rain and time and the dissolution of cover identities. Some things, like the moment a general realized his daughter had been saved by the woman whose name he carried on his skin, those things happened regardless of whether anyone was watching. Margaret picked up her box and got on the bus. Behind her, Cedar Creek Medical continued its operations. Dr. Mercer continued his shift, confident in his fabricated documentation, secure in his institutional power, unaware that a Pentagon liaison was currently sitting in the hospital administrator's office with photographs of his pharmaceutical kickbacks and prescribing patterns that deviated from standard pediatric care by margins too wide to explain. 3 days. That's all it took to change everything. 3 days later, a routine background check flagged something that made the hospital administrator's blood drain into his shoes. Margaret Walsh. Classified clearance level. Pentagon liaison required for any personnel action. The administrator's hand shook as he called General Callahan, and Callahan's voice on the phone sounded like concrete cracking. "She's still in San Antonio." Within 6 hours, a black Suburban pulled up to Margaret's apartment building on Ashford Street, rain hammering the windshield like machine gun fire, and General James Callahan stepped out wearing a dress blue uniform with ribbons that caught the streetlight like medals of a man who'd seen every kind of darkness. Behind him came the hospital CEO, 2 administrators, and a Pentagon security liaison in a charcoal suit. Margaret opened the door before they knocked. She was standing in jeans and a faded Army physical therapy hoodie, the kind of clothing that made her look smaller, invisible, just another face in a crowd, but Callahan's eyes found her and locked. Emma pushed past the adults into Margaret's living room, her 7-year-old body finally moving without the stuttering fear of seizures, her hair braided neatly by her mother, and she looked up at the tall woman in the hoodie with absolute certainty. "Mommy says you're the Nightingale." The words hung in the air. Callahan's face went white, not pale, but the color of a man watching a ghost materialize in front of him, and his jaw worked silently for 3 seconds before he reached into his jacket pocket with the precision of someone reaching for classified documents. His phone came out. His thumb moved. He found the page he needed. When he read aloud, his voice had dropped into the register used only for things that matter. Captain Margaret Walsh, for extraordinary heroism under fire in Ramadi, when she single-handedly extracted 4 wounded Marines including then-Lieutenant James Callahan from a compound collapsing under sustained small arms fire, without regard for personal safety, under conditions that would have ended the lives of operators with 3 times her experience. He lowered the phone. His eyes were wet. "That was you. You were the one who pulled me out. You had to carry me 200 yards through open ground." Margaret's composure was absolute, as it always was. Not a tremor. Not a flicker. She simply looked at him and said, "Different person, sir. Easy to confuse after 7 years." But that wasn't the worst part. The video was already out there, spreading across social media and medical forums and military communities like a wildfire fed by wind. Someone in room 308 that day, a visitor, a family member, perhaps one of the staff Margaret had trained, had captured every second of Mercer's tirade on their phone. Nurse night shift, incompetent care, dangerous disregard for protocol. His smirk as he waved the fabricated chart. His condescending voice while a child lay seizing 3 feet away. The video hit TikTok first, then Instagram, then LinkedIn, then Reddit, and within 24 hours it had been viewed by 4 million people. The algorithmic gods had ordained it a moment of reckoning. Medical professionals shared it on closed forums. Military spouses tagged it on family pages. Nurses who'd experienced Mercer's arrogance commented beneath it with their own stories. 16 different stories. 23. 37. A pattern emerged. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a man wielding institutional power like a weapon against those who couldn't fight back. The morning Mercer's former mentor from Johns Hopkins saw it. He was eating oatmeal at 6:37 a.m., watching the video on his iPad while sunlight filtered through his kitchen window. Dr. Howard Chen, the man who'd written Mercer's recommendation letters 20 years ago, who believed in his potential, who'd helped him climb into the position where he thought he was untouchable. Chen watched the video twice. Then he picked up the phone. His voice, when he spoke, sounded like a door closing and locking. "David, I don't know you anymore. I don't recognize who you became." Mercer tried to explain. Tried to justify. The words tumbled out like a defense strategy. But Chen cut him off with surgical precision. "I'm resigning from the Cedar Creek Board of Directors, effective immediately. I won't be associated with this. With you." The call ended. Nobody hung up a phone anymore. The gesture belonged to another era, but the silence that followed Chen's words had the weight of an old-fashioned disconnect, a clean severance that nothing could repair. Board policy required automatic investigation when a director resigned citing ethical concerns. 72 hours. That's all the hospital's compliance office needed to uncover what Margaret's meticulous documentation had been quietly recording for months. The kickback scheme. The pharmaceutical rep's weekly visits to Mercer's office. The pattern of prescriptions for Emma Callahan and 17 other pediatric patients, medications that made no clinical sense, that cost more than alternatives, that generated commissions Mercer deposited into accounts 3 states away. The inflated billing codes. The pressure on residents to follow Mercer's protocols without question. The board didn't just investigate. They coordinated with the Texas Medical Board, which coordinated with the DEA, which coordinated with the FBI. Mercer's medical license suspension came first, a notice that hit his desk like a punch from an invisible force. Then the criminal investigation. Then the termination. His wife of 14 years looked at him across their breakfast table and said she was taking their daughters to stay with her mother until she figured out what came next. His colleagues stopped returning his calls. Physicians he'd trained now refused to acknowledge him at conferences. The medical community he'd spent 20 years building his reputation in simply turned away, the way a body rejects a foreign object. Within a month, his medical license was permanently revoked. The number was printed in the Texas Medical Board Gazette, case #2847, TX, a Mercer revocation. Permanent. Unappealable. The end. 6 weeks after the firing, Margaret stood outside a classroom at San Antonio Community College, looking through reinforced glass at Dr. David Mercer, no longer doctor, just David Mercer, man in a polo shirt with a community college logo embroidered over his heart. He was demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy named Annie, his movements mechanical and spiritless, explaining to a classroom of bored students who didn't know he used to run a pediatric ICU, who didn't know he'd destroyed lives in pursuit of money, who didn't know that the person watching him through the window was the reason his career had evaporated like morning dew. Emma Callahan held Margaret's hand, her small fingers tracing the outline of the faded unit patch that Margaret had finally, officially, sewn onto the outside of her jacket, no longer hidden in jacket linings, no longer secret, but visible, worn with the bearing of someone who'd earned the right to be seen. "Is that the bad doctor?" Emma asked, in that clinical way children have of identifying threats. "He was," Margaret said simply. She didn't look away from Mercer's face, at the way his shoulders sagged in the polo shirt, at the resignation that had aged him a decade in 6 weeks. "He doesn't matter anymore, sweetheart." They stood there for another minute, the rain drumming against the college building, the sound of Mercer's voice explaining cardiopulmonary resuscitation to students who would forget it by next semester, while Emma held the hand of the woman who'd broken every rule to keep her alive. Then Margaret turned, and they walked back toward the parking lot, where General Callahan waited in his dress blues, his posture carrying the weight of understanding that he'd almost lost his daughter to a man whose arrogance had turned medicine into a transaction. The formal ceremony happened inside Cedar Creek Medical, in the main conference room where Margaret had never been invited before. She wore her Marine dress uniform, the one she'd kept in a garment bag for 7 years, and the ribbons across her chest told the story that her scrubs never could. The Navy Cross hung below her heart. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Purple Heart from Ramadi, 2 of them, side by side, a matching pair of sacrifices. General Callahan stood beside her as the hospital CEO Sherman delivered an apology that sounded rehearsed, hollow, and true all at once. We failed to recognize your service. We failed to protect our staff. We failed our patient. We are profoundly sorry, Captain Walsh. Margaret accepted with a single nod, her composure absolute, her bearing that of someone who'd been apologized to by commanders in theaters of war and understood that words couldn't repair what had been broken. But the real moment came after, in the pediatric ICU where Emma had seized, where Margaret had been systematically humiliated, where 7 different doctors had missed the obvious truth. The staff lined the hallway. Nurses she'd trained. Residents she'd mentored. The 3, Sarah, Jennifer, and Tom, who'd abandoned her in the break room, their faces carrying the specific shame of people who'd known better and chosen cowardice instead. Margaret stopped at the unit board where Mercer's written warning had hung. Someone had removed it. In its place was a frame. Her citation, printed on parchment. Below it, a bronze plaque with engraved letters that caught the fluorescent light, Captain Margaret Walsh, RN, Operator Nightingale, true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Emma ran to her, wrapping her small arms around Margaret's waist with the certainty of a child who'd been given back her life. General Callahan approached slowly, deliberately, with the formality of a man approaching something sacred. He rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo was faded now, older than the others on his forearm, the ink having aged from black to that dark blue-gray that happens when needles enter skin 7 years ago. M. Walsh. Block letters. I looked right at you and didn't see who you were. Margaret touched his shoulder once, briefly, the kind of contact that carries more weight than a speech. You weren't supposed to, sir. That was the mission. She knelt to Emma's level, this girl who would have been lost to encephalitis if Margaret had followed orders, if she'd stayed quiet, if she'd chosen her mission over her oath to every person she'd ever sworn to protect. You feeling better, sweetheart? No more seizures? Emma's smile was radiant, the smile of a child who'd been given back the normal world. Mommy says I can go back to soccer. Margaret nodded and stood, adjusted her uniform with the precision of someone for whom these motions had meaning, and that's when every person in the hallway, every nurse, every resident, every administrator who'd watched Mercer destroy her, rose to attention and saluted. Not the rank. Something deeper. The choice she'd made when everything hung in the balance. The moment she'd stopped being invisible and become unforgettable. She walked out of Cedar Creek Medical for the last time, the unit patch visible on her shoulder, her head high, the rain outside matching the rhythm of her boots on the tile, and the doors closed behind her with the kind of finality that marks the end of one story and the beginning of another. Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, let us know in the comments, we'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.